Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of Boys in the Cave. My name is Tanzim, your solo co-host again for today, and alhamdulillah, we're joined by special guests. So before we crack into it, you guys probably checked out our last two episodes. It was regarding the shootings at Christchurch, and the format of it was that we do off the bat wanted to inform people how to approach the whole situation. So that's why we got Uthman and Yasser to get their perspectives and ideas of how to approach the situation. But the reason for this episode today is to give more of a rundown of what actually happened, the facts on the ground, because, on the first 3-4 days, a lot of the facts could have been, wrong or misinterpreted or correct as well. But we wanted to, wait a week and a half to get more of the actual facts and see what's actually played out and get more perspectives. So that's why today I have with me journalist Ryma Tchier. So Ryma has been a radio presenter for 107.3 FM, writer for The Tempest, contributor to Vice, and currently works as a journalist in Melbourne and Sydney for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, based in the newsroom covering stories that affect the cities and the state. He's now working in the legal department. So assalamu alaikum, Ryma, and welcome to Boys in the Cave.
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you for having me.
Anytime. Look, you've probably been working overtime in regards to the unfortunate situation that occurred at Christchurch. And for everyone who may not be aware, that's why we wanted to, cover the story. But it was a traumatic situation, not just for the Muslim community, but for humanity at large. So what did you make of the situation that occurred 2 weeks ago?
To be honest, 2 weeks isn't enough to really digest what happened. We're still incredibly close to the event and everything is still very much reactionary at this stage. If we wanted to get a gauge of where we were and how it really is going to impact us, that's something that we're going to see 6 months down the track or maybe a year in. But from what we've seen in the way it's playing out in Australian politics, within the last couple of weeks, if that's going to serve as any indicator, it's going very poorly. And in comparison to what is panning out in New Zealand, you couldn't have asked for more separate worlds. It's like we're separated by we're separated by a sea, but it's like we're talking about two different planets. So the politics here has been incredibly toxic, basically turning this horrific event that has affected a community so deeply and so tragically into a political football. And it's more or less served as a gateway to a platform that is serving to basically advertise for the federal election, which for, if your viewers don't know, the Australian federal election is coming up in May. And that means that the current government's basically going through a litmus test right now, and both the opposition, smaller parties, and the government are basically trying to grab at those votes. And they've used this event, whether they've done it wisely or not is a separate question, but it's just really disrespectful as to how their lives have become belittled in juxtaposition to what's happening in New Zealand, where they're still talking about it as a human event and they're still trying to keep that humanity in. Yes, you've got, reforms in gun laws, but if we're going to contrast it with here, with what's happening with, quote unquote fringe parties like One Nation or those radical elements of the Liberal Party, it's basically just it's just disregarding what we as a community have faced, and it's just using it to get up on a soapbox. So we're still really emotional, still really volatile in how we go about doing this, and a long-term solution really hasn't been found as of yet, but it really is a tough time. I don't think we're going to get anywhere fast anytime soon.
You've actually touched on a few points in regards to the political football game that's been played. I actually do want to go deep into that because, as you mentioned, New Zealand and Australia have been completely different. I would like to get your thoughts about in regards to what exactly in what ways, but I will ask you that question later. But I do want to, as a direction of the episode, just to get some fact checking first, just to make it clear in regards to what the facts, lay out the facts first from the events that occurred in Christchurch, and then we'll go more deep into like analyzing the whole situation. But in general, I'm just going to mention a few facts. Just tell me if I'm right or wrong. But the mass shooting that did occur at the mosque at Masjid Al Noor, it occurred at Masjid Al Noor in Hagley Park at 1:40 p.m. local time, and the Linwood Mosque was also targeted, and the death toll stands at, I think, currently 50, and there's actually 50 people still injured. I'm not too sure. And would you say those facts are correct at this point in time, or?
At this stage, I think the death toll rose at 51 because, unfortunately, one of the injured succumbed to their injuries and they were in a critical condition. But very much, it's right across the board. It happened 1:40 p.m. at New Zealand time, which means we found out about it at around, I think, at around 3:40 p.m. That would have been when the brunt of it actually hit Australia, in the sense that they found out that there was a gunman at large. I heard the actual news of people being killed from the news alerts at the ABC at around 1 o'clock. So 1 o'clock our time, Australia time, which would have been 3 p.m. New Zealand time. So that's correct. It's basically just started out with a few deaths at the mosque in Hagley Park, where he methodically went in, live streamed, had basically military-style weapons, assault rifles, with names of previous shooters that carried out similar attacks in Canada and in Italy. Whether it served as inspiration or not, that remains to be seen. He basically went into the brothers section, carried out those massacres. We all heard of the basically monumental phrase of "Hello, brother," of that Haji Daud Allah Hamum, basically welcoming him into the mosque, and then went out, then entered the women's section, carried it out then, and then seemingly went back into the men's section just to make sure there weren't any stragglers, went back into his vehicle, and then drove over to Linwood Mosque. And this was all basically filmed on a GoPro that he recorded with in the car and that he had on his person.
Okay, because even with me, I remember Jummah prayers for me here finished at 2 o'clock. I remember I was in the masjid. I literally finished prayers straight away on my phone, unfortunately, but that's how it is. And then literally the first news came up was the shootings, and I'm like, I was a bit sad, but I didn't know the extent to the situation. And then I went and grabbed a feed right after, and then I had people sending me the live stream, and this was around like 10 past 2 or 15 past 2 or something, I think around that time, or maybe before 2:30, and I'm watching him like shoot down people, like subhanallah, and
it was horrific.
It was I don't know, like, how can someone have the mental capacity to do that, but I was just shook. And in terms of, you mentioned he went, and I think you said you drove to the Linwood Mosque and carried out the same shootings, because through the live stream we only saw the shootings. Is it at Masjid Al Noor? Do you know facts about that?
Well, basically what was recorded was at Masjid Al Noor. We know that he did go to Linwood Mosque, but as you said, the recordings basically cut out there. But I think by the time that he went in there, police had basically barricaded all mosques within Christchurch. So the police were basically on his tail. That really, in one way, it takes a massacre for police to mobilize in a town like Christchurch, where your most, serious events would have been just earthquake relief and aftermaths of what would happen as a result of that, whether it be property damage or injuries. But I think this really spurred them into action. And the part of the horrific thing was that he live streamed it as if it was just a casual event that you put up on Facebook and Twitter. And more concerningly is that Facebook and Twitter's community standards or guidelines weren't even flagged that this would have been content that needed to be removed. I think it's still swirling around somewhere in the interwebs. As much as they try to regulate it, you can't really stop this kind of content from spreading, because you're dealing with multinational corporations that don't operate within one jurisdiction. Their whole plan is to move from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. That way tax laws are in effect, or that they're not tied down by a certain set of laws. And that's what multinational corporations basically focus on. And if it's social media and if it's up on the internet, it's basically just making its rounds in, the dark web or in 4chan or 8chan amongst supporters. And even in itself, the footage is so inherently violating and violent, because I saw it and I knew that there were debates going on in the newsroom at the time as to whether it is ethical to actually show this footage. They only went so far as to operate, more like take stills, and they weren't stills of any of the bodies. It was basically just him prior entering the mosque or while he was in the car. The ABC made that editorial decision, as opposed to other news outlets like news.com, who actually embedded the footage into their article, and I think a couple of other commercial outlets as well, which is really disrespectful, because not only is it such confronting footage, because part of the element is that this is supposed to be a safe society. You wouldn't expect this kind of violence here. Unfortunately, people would make the assumption that you'd expect it in a developing country or in the Middle East or regions where wars are not that uncommon or tension or conflict happen daily. That's part of the horror, and you feel this sense of violation. But what I saw when I took out of it, after being in shock, was that these people were disrespected. Their dignity and privacy was completely robbed because their moments of their death was broadcast for the whole world to see. And that's something that you can't put into words. How do you explain, especially to their families, if some of the victims have extremely young children, how do you explain to them that their parents or that their loved ones' last moments were basically just, fodder, and a complete shout out to, randomly to PewDiePie? Like it completely just violated everything about their right to privacy and human dignity. And they weren't, at the end of the day, they weren't supposed to be killed doing this. They were supposed to be safe.
Oh, I think Sky News did a bit of the shootings, and then I think Sky News Australia condemned Sky News or something along those lines. I'm not too sure about the news, but you mentioned how I think third or second world countries, they do show these type of footages on the news. And it's actually true, because I'm Bangladeshi. My background's Bangladeshi, and all the time when I watch like Bangladeshi news, because at home we do have like a box where you can view Bangladesh news channels. So my parents watch it, not me. Yeah, exactly. And they're always showing like they were showing the shooting. Like when they were broadcasting, the news of the New Zealand shooting, they were actually showing the killing that happened. And not only that, it's a normal thing they do in news. But why do you think that's the case? Is it because, as you mentioned, they're used to killings back like in third world countries? Because even in Bangladesh, it's not like a common thing. Like Bangladesh isn't in war per se, you know what I mean? And you have like kind of strict regulations.
Right. But it's prone to conflict. It's not unfamiliar with it, as opposed to the West, I guess. What I take away from it is that it's a lot more complicated than it seems, because there are a lot of factors at play, especially when it comes to international news. Because when we look back at, we can take Mali as the most recent example. Basically, international news outlets made that decision to show footage or show images of dead bodies on the ground after the raids in the village in central Mali. It really comes into this discussion of the value of black and brown bodies and where that sits, as opposed to, where that sits in racism in international coverage, because you've got this side of where a lot of the international coverage is coming out of the West, as opposed to, like, say, Al Jazeera. I don't know if that's a unique exception, and I'll get to that. But they basically make these decisions ahead of time in saying that because these areas are prone to conflict, people aren't that desensitized as to seeing dead bodies in, say Gaza or Syria or Sudan or what have you. And it's very much plays into the whole, their lives are more inferior because they live in these conditions, as opposed to when, for example, when Charlie Hebdo happened or when the Paris attacks happened, there was no footage whatsoever of the victims. If there were, the most you would get would be someone would be carted off into an ambulance and that person would have just been in a serious condition. There's this respect in saying that, oh no, this is a tragedy because they were safe. They were supposed to be safe in a Western society and therefore their lives were cruelly taken away. And it really just puts the onus back on these developing countries in saying that, well, if you actually secured your borders or if you were, a functioning country, this wouldn't be happening to your people. So when it does, the only way you can illustrate that horror is to show bodies, and it cheapens our lives. It cheapens our worth. That's why I found that similar thing was happening, at least in English, or European and American news outlets. When they decided to show the footage, it follows that same line of thinking, is because majority of the victims, if not all of the victims, were ethnic and were brown or black bodies. And that follows that same line. What I think happens when it gets to developing countries choosing to show this footage, I think it's a different mindset. When Al Jazeera first, and I remember this distinctly, it was my first exposure to the Palestinian conflict or the war on Gaza. It was the first round of it, and it was my first time actually seeing and accepting that there were violent parts. There were cruel things happening to innocent people, and people's lives were at risk and they were dying from war. When I look at it that way, I think there's a different mentality that comes into play, because there's this sense where, at least, amongst the Arab world, there's this sense of brutal honesty in that they don't sugarcoat things. Death is part and parcel of our lives as Muslims, right? So we constantly see death. There are funerals happening all the time, and that plays into the whole idea of saying, well, there's no point in hiding this. Yes, it's gruesome, but it's a fact of life. It comes into like an acceptance of that. Not that I'm condoning it or saying that it's right, but I do realize that they're more likely to share more or be more accepting of brutal coverage, or wouldn't be as squirmish and say, oh, this is distressing to some viewers. Yes, they would put that out now and add those little edits in, but I think there's a shift in mindset in accordance to that.
Yeah, you brought up a lot of good points. One thing, because you mentioned the Paris attacks, I remember when it did happen, a lot of people were wondering if it actually did happen, because there was no sort of footage. So there's all these weird conspiracy theories around it. And that brings up a good point in terms of the standards they have in place, so that they don't broadcast the actual videos of the live shootings, all the shootings that occurred at that time. And you brought up Mali as well, because like those attacks happened in Mali were like horrific. I think 160 people are confirmed dead.
Yep,
and
correct.
You mentioned that our lives are kind of cheapened. Do you think that the idea of how, because I guess the Western media is very powerful, they try to portray as them as they the West is the place to be, essentially, and there's all these killings that are happening, but they don't really give importance to it. So when a killing does happen here, there is a lot of importance given to it. So do you feel that it kind of plays into the narrative of the lives in the West are more valuable than, say, the lives of the third world countries, compared to the lives of people in the third world countries?
Oh, 100%, because it's all about framing. Like you have to really, when we think about the media that we consume and the news that we consume, especially now, we have to be incredibly critical about where we get our information from and really understand how it's being framed, because there are facts. But unfortunately, in a post-modern society, everything becomes a contextual truth, when in reality, we know it's not the case, but we've gotten to that point, and there's no return unless we seriously work to educate people on how to consume information. Essentially, when it comes to Western media outlets and how they're framed, especially when it comes to, initially when it came through the cable news network, so you've got like CNN, you've got Fox, public broadcasters that cross boundaries like the BBC and whatnot, when they decide to show these images of violence happening in Africa, it comes under the racist assumption that this is part and parcel of life in Africa. Africa comes across as a stereotype in that, it is famine-ridden, there are droughts, people are starving, they're poor, health is deteriorating, rights of women are basically non-existent. And it really positions Africa within this somewhat colonial lens in saying that this is a continent that's so rich in resources, but it's full of wasted potential because the people can't help themselves. And it's sad, and we have to help them. That's why, if you've seen poverty tourism, or if you know of it, you might know someone who, you went to uni with that decided to go on exchange and basically help out an orphanage and take selfies and say, look at me, I'm like helping humanity because they seriously need money.
It's pretty
right?
common.
Right? It actually plays into that same stereotype when it completely disregards the agency of the African people. And on top of that, the whole positioning of Africa as a country, as opposed to 53 countries that have different cultures, sets of laws, basically, ways of life. It's all completely disregarded. And what is most ominous is that when Western media come in to position it, the institutions themselves were there when European powers were colonizing Africa at the time. So it's no mistake that they're positioning Africa in this way. They were basically aiding and abetting colonialist efforts for, raiding resources, basically, oppressing the people, taking advantage, of the opportunity to commit, heinous crimes against humanity that they don't need to pay reparations for. Like, it's no coincidence whatsoever that at the end of the day, brown and particularly black bodies are that cheap because that colonial assumption still exists. And it pans out in different ways. We see it in the ability for news outlets to show without a blink of an eye dead bodies in Mali. And we see it play out in how the African American community is treated in the US with regards to police brutality. We see it here in how we've basically villainized African gangs in Melbourne. It very much is manifesting itself in different ways, and there's a reluctance amongst Western media to accept it, which was why there are a lot of grassroots journalists who are basically moving up the ranks. And it's a very hard decision to make, but you have to decide whether you want to work out of the system and try to go independent to try and undo this, or you work within the system and slowly change it from the bottom up in the aim to get to the top. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but it's definitely not unintentional.
That's really good insights in terms of how things are portrayed in different countries. Like, even me, when I was reading some articles, I remember it said the most booming economies at the moment, and up there was Kenya as well. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the African countries are actually making big statements when it comes to having booming economies. So it's unfortunate how probably 10 years ago I would have had the same idea of what Africa is then, and compared to now, if I was just following what the normal mainstream media mm-hmm. are saying. So it's unfortunate that these sort of situations are occurring. And what would you say is the solution then? What can we do to change that sort of
narrative? Education, but it has to come from the citizens itself, because when we think about media as an institution, we tend to think of it as this fourth estate that's supposed to keep, the branches of power accountable. But where do these journalists come from? They come from the general population. They're not just plucked out of thin air. They're created and molded out of the situations that they're in. And the reason I know so much about Africa is because I come from that continent. I'm North African, and I know what it's like. I've been to Africa my whole life, as particularly North Africa. So it's very much like just ignorance and a lack of education. And I cannot stress this enough, because people would look at me weird and be like, well, how can you be from Africa if you're not black? And it's like, well, sweetie, there's this whole portion called North Africa. And guess what? Wow, the indigenous people are kind of pale. Or there's a real disconnect in knowledge when it comes to basically covering Africa. The booming economies, the technological sector. Basically, China is investing so heavily in Africa for a reason. It's because there is not only untapped potential, but Africans themselves are taking it upon themselves to build their own businesses, their own economy. The whole idea of soccer itself, it's such a like economically fruitful venture because there's a huge love for African soccer. Just that alone, in the leagues, in the way that they, basically get their players from there to, the French league or Spanish league, or, make it to those high clubs, like for example in the Premier League. Like there's a whole other world when it comes to Africa as a continent and with separate countries, that it really needs to dispel the stereotype that basically the continent is behind. That is true for any developing country, but now with the rate of modernization and industrialization, they're catching up. Like, it's not new. Everyone over there at least has 3 phones on them. Like, it's beyond that. My friend was telling me, in Somalia, it's gotten to the point where, you'd think of, well, if you're staying in Mogadishu, you're like, oh gosh, that's the Somali capital. Al-Shabaab and Somali pirates are going to come for me. No, they use their phones. They use their phones for cash. No one actually carries cash anymore. They were already on the Cash App wave before we were. Like, yeah, like it's just simple things like that. It's really, really, it really does a disservice to Africa as a whole to just write it off and just keep it under this famine-riddled, we need white people's help and money narrative when it's not the case.
And it even depends on what you define as, catching up. Because I remember there were studies being done, and in general, Africans tend to be the most strongest out of all people. But not only that, even the high IQs tend to be better than our IQ. And you can probably put that down to the way of living that we have compared to them. Perhaps, I'm not too sure about the finer details, but I guess in terms of catching up, we're actually looking at from the perspective of, high-rise buildings and people wearing suits. And
we're holding them to a Western standard of catching up,
exactly,
basically.
But in reality, they actually have it over us in terms of intellect and, strength, all these things that we also value, but we're actually looking at from the perspective of, can they catch up in terms of building big buildings and wearing suits and ties, all that sort of stuff. So I guess that's where we need to change the narrative. But I do want to pull the conversation back because we were touching on Christchurch before, in terms of confirming the details on the ground, because the attacker, Brenton Harrison Tarrant, he mentioned there were early reports that mentioned he wasn't the only shooter. So they said there were 4 people charged initially, with 3 males and 1 female, and then there were reports later that were saying it was just Brenton himself. So could you clarify those sort of information for the audience?
Yeah, sure. So what happened initially, those first 6 hours were incredibly rough and fast. So what Christchurch police basically did was, no one was charged at that point. They had arrested 4 people at that point, which was 3 men and 1 woman. And then once they were able to interrogate them and investigate, they discharged the other 3, but then actually arrested and laid charges on Tarrant himself. So I get how people can basically get misinformed, but what happens is that police don't charge immediately. They basically take people into custody and arrest them, but they do have to conduct that initial fact finding, and that does take some time, but they were able to make that discern that earlier on, due to the way that forensics were working on the ground. So I can see how people get confused. Well, initially there were 4 people involved, and now it's just down to 1. It could be that those other 3 were basically at the wrong place at the wrong time, or that their suspicious behavior could have been led to something else as opposed to being associated or involved in the massacre. So that's what happened.
So was Brenton pretty much a lone wolf in this attack, would you say?
I hate that term lone wolf because then it just absolves him of all the responsibility that he's done. But yes, in that sense, he had acted of his own accord. But just recently, I think a couple of days ago, it was reported that there's this right-wing basically coalition in Austria that had basically been funding this person. So that, we've just now discovered, yes, he is basically working on his own accord, but was he part of a larger network of white supremacists around the world? Who did he have contact with prior to this attack? It's slowly unraveling at this stage, and that's what we were waiting to get to after the initial 2 weeks of, shock and horror. It's now trying to figure out, well, how did he go about doing this? It's so premeditated and so calculated that it cannot just be one person involved in this. But yes, he did on his own, in that sense, carry out the attack.
Okay, so sorry, you said an Austrian party, so are you saying that possibly he got funded by, I don't know, a group or a party overseas in order to conduct the attacks, or they've been assisting him through the process?
Well, that's what's been reported. They said that there are actually connections between that and the group that he was part of in New Zealand. So it's really, the plot is thickening. And basically, I know forensics and, the New Zealand form of ASIO and secret intelligence organizations are going to be working around the clock to try and figure this out. But I think we knew deep down it wasn't just going to be someone who was just inspired by, white supremacist rhetoric to just carry out this attack of their own accord. It really just cements the fact for us as a community that there are sophisticated networks with funding that are operating in the shadows that have been working against, the whole multicultural project in Western societies and really do seek to dismantle and eliminate that. And it's only now just come to light with evidence for basically the rest of society.
And okay, because that's really interesting. I didn't actually know about that. So would you say when he did carry the attacks, he did deliberately, do we know that he, deliberately planned on attacking those specific mosques at that time for Jummah prayers, because he knew, Friday prayers is where, the Muslims congregate and conduct their prayers? Do you think it was very calculated in that sense that he was going to plan, this day, this time and carry out those attacks? Or was it kind of spur of the moment sort of thing?
It can't have been spur of the moment. This suggests that there was a reconnaissance mission. It's not common knowledge for people to know that Muslims congregate at Friday, or mostly Muslim men congregate on a Friday at midday to hear a sermon and perform midday prayers. It hasn't reached that level of, we know that, the Sabbath is on Saturday and everyone goes to church on Sunday. Do you know what I mean? It's not that well known. We just know that, Friday is important in general, but that really does have elements of premeditation because he selected the mosque. He knew the exact time of, I know mosques have roughly different times of where they pray Luhr, right? Luhr adhan goes off, but then they'll decide to, maybe do the khutbah and Jum'ah, 15 minutes after the fact or what have you. Each mosque has its own routine, right? It's not an accident that he knew that. He definitely went in and did his research about it. Then premeditate and select his rifles, the car, set up the GoPro, set up his live stream. It's not just something that you do out of the whim. This was a very well thought through attack. And it's very hard to ignore that and try to justify that he was mentally unsound or ill when he did it. No, this was someone that was perfectly sane, because if they dare to, or if the defense in his trial actually dared to bring up mental illness, and I have a feeling they probably would because he needs a whole range of defenses right now, I can't see that standing up in a court of law because, on the opposite spectrum, it's like when terrorists of our creed and our religion do it, it's like we're all immune from mental illnesses. It's like, no, we had, straight on faculties. We knew exactly what we were doing. We had 100% intention, and it's case closed. No one looks at it further. So his actions don't suggest an element of insanity to me, and that's what makes it all the more terrifying.
SubhanAllah. And there's a reason why I asked in terms of calculating tax. You may know yourself because the Bangladesh cricket team were actually touring New Zealand at that time, and I'm actually Bangladeshi and I'm a big cricket fan, so I was following like every game and everything. So then they were meant to play at Hagley Oval, and I was actually looking forward to that game Saturday morning. I think it was a 9 a.m. match because I had everything planned like the whole day. I'm like, I'm gonna watch the game, and then the attack happened on Friday, and they actually, because of the horrific, situation, they had to cancel the game the next day, and they actually flew back. That was the last test match, and it was interesting because the Bangladesh cricket team were actually, I think what happened, I read the stories where I think they finished, or they actually were walking towards the masjid. Actually, no, they were walking towards the masjid. They were like 5 minutes away, and they actually saw the shootings. They saw people like, I guess, walking out, blood, or they saw blood everywhere, and they actually had to like escape and run away. And Tamim Iqbal, who's actually the opening batsman for Bangladesh, gave a call to Mohammed Isam, who's a reporter for ESPN Crick Info, and he said, come help us please. And Mohammed Isam was saying, I thought he was joking because he did a piece on the Crick Info page, because I follow the page religiously, and he thought he was joking first up, but then he came and he saw the actual situation that was occurring, and then he spotted the team. I think they wanted to hide in the bus, but they thought that if the shooter came into the bus, that's like gold mine for him. He would just have like 20 people to shoot up. So they thought like, okay, no, we have to actually kind of scatter, not be together, but at the same time be together and move across the oval. I think they actually walked across the oval and were kind of not sprinting, but they were soft jogging, and they escaped the situation. So I thought it was like, subhanAllah, like they were actually at that time. So I'm like, was it that calculated that perhaps he wanted to target the Bangladesh cricket team as well? That was just a thought. But do you know anything about that specifically?
That is something that I think the court is going to try and uncover, because that is either a really eerie coincidence or just another plot. We don't know if he was actually specifically targeting the Bangladeshi cricket team. That wasn't something that was apparent in any of the messages that he left behind on 8chan or in his manifesto or when he was speaking during his live stream. So there's not enough evidence to back up that correlation. Although I don't think it's going to escape the court's notice when they do go in and, try him, that it became an event already in its own right of international significance. But the fact that it was such a close call for a team that's so important, it wouldn't have escaped their notice. But if it was supposed to attack them by now, I think police would have maybe speculated on the motive. They don't tend to do that a lot, but if there's something that they know for certain, they'll actually say it at the time, because police, believe it or not, don't get to make claims out of the blue. And if it was that case, I think we would have heard about it in those initial press conferences, when they actually, basically affirmed his motive and said that he was inspired by white supremacy, or that this attack was deliberate against, Muslims worshipping on a Friday. I hadn't heard or read anything on that. I had been trying to follow it up, but I think at this stage they're treating it as a correlation.
Okay, I don't. For the audience listening, I don't want to make it seem that I'm focusing on the Bangladesh cricket team. I was just bringing that up because it was actually a coincidence. It was eerily
so
scary
terrifying.
How they were there as well.
They just missed it by a margin. Can you imagine how I don't even want to imagine it. Like, that would have just been horrific. That Bray just shot like an entire team. That would have been horrifying, and that would have just escalated, beyond what we're seeing right now. Like, I don't even want to fathom it.
Yeah, subhanAllah. And as you mentioned, the court hearings and, speculating the mindset of Brenton. But because Brenton is, I guess, in a court process at the moment, so could you explain what's actually happened from when he got sentenced to, I don't think he's even got sentenced. I'm not too sure
No,
of the
he's
details, but I
not.
know that he's obviously locked up. But would you tell like what's actually happened with him specifically at this point in time?
Basically, he's in custody in jail. So obviously he was rejected bail. Everyone in Australia, or Australian media in general, basically got a crash course in New Zealand criminal law and contempt laws. And for your viewers, contempt is basically something that affects media specifically. It's trying or basically following orders or laws that you can't report on certain things that would prejudice a trial or, inform a jury or in any way disrupt the court process, because especially nowadays with the internet and what we've seen with, the massive debacle that was George Pell with suppression orders, contempt of court is basically trying to balance the right of open justice in where media is basically reporting on what happens in our courts. And that's important because we need to know how these laws are interpreted. People seem to think that Parliament decide how things are meant to, they do decide meanings and they do make the laws, but how they actually apply to life is decided out of the courts because it's their job to interpret what Parliament meant by that and apply it to real life scenarios. So in doing that, especially when it comes to criminal cases and instances such as these, you're balancing the right for open justice to allow the public and the media to report on what's happening in court, and then also juxtapose that with balancing the fairness of justice and the presumption of innocence. And I'm assuming the same thing happens in New Zealand because both Australia and New Zealand are common law system countries. What that means is that our legal systems derive from the UK. Canada is also like that. The US is its own hybrid, but basically anywhere where the UK colonized, they implemented that same system of law, as opposed to the civil law system that European countries have. So in this case, he basically has a trial date set for the 5th of April. And the way that they're going about it, interestingly enough, is that they're going through with murder charges. So he has 50 or I believe 51 charges of murder against him specifically right now. And he is in remand, in custody, in jail right now until that first hearing. So he's already made an appearance in court himself. It's called a mention. So basically that's when you go in and introduce the matter to the court saying, here is this man. He's indicted with 50 charges of murder. And then that gives time for the defense and a prosecution to build up the charges. But what happens in New Zealand is that they're going to basically go through each and every charge separately. So right now he's going to be going into the first charge for the first victim at this stage. And it's going to basically go through each and every story up until the last, either 51st person. And what I find interesting is that I haven't seen any terror offences, despite the fact that the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Arden, refuses to say his name, and rightly so. It's not that his name is suppressed or anything, but she refers to him as a terrorist. But I hadn't seen Christchurch police or even at the federal level, New Zealand police, charge him with any terrorist offences. And I am really puzzled by that because 50 charges of murder is huge. I mean, I can't see this man, collectively going out with sentences that won't go beyond life. Like we know, we can assume that much. But the fact that there are no terrorism charges really, really puzzles me because we can't just treat it as murder. There's this political motivation that goes along with it. And that normally would have been the case here if the roles were reversed. If it was a brown person and they did this against 50 white people, they would have laid down the terrorism charge immediately without question. It would have happened within the first 24 hours in addition to charges of murder. So the world is really waiting to see how the New Zealand justice system really works. What we do know as well is that this isn't going to be solved within a year. This is 50 charges. They're going to, try their best, but you can't really speed up things like this. Anyone with experience working in the court system, you know that these things take months, if not years. So we're in it for the long haul with this.
I don't want to sort of jump the gun in regards to, because I have heard that argument a lot in terms of, why he's not put on terrorist charges, why it's a murder charges. I have no idea. There might be some ruling in the New Zealand system where
that's right, yeah.
situations like this happen to be like a murder case instead. But the only question, like you kind of answered it towards the end of what you said, that 5th of April, like things like this of this nature take time, and the shootings did happen like 2 weeks ago. So the question would be like, why is it taking so much time? Would you say that it's because these sort of instances and situations take a lot of time to kind of process and go through the court process and I don't know, do things the right judicial manner, would you say?
No, that's right. Basically, in response to your first question, it's right. Like I said, the world's basically getting a crash course in how New Zealand law works, and we're not familiar with their anti-terror legislation and how that applies. Maybe they might charge him at the end. Maybe they might charge him during. Maybe they're still compiling evidence in regards to that. So we have to wait and see. But it's very much the court process that takes time. Knowing from experience, litigation and the court process, it's really, really thorough. You do get these, you are able to speed it up at stages, but the whole, you need to file evidence, you need to do affidavits, you need to get witnesses sworn in, you need to compile your arguments, you need to make sure the court has these documents. You also need to make sure that your case, you get what the defense is saying and the defense gets what the prosecution is saying. So that way no one's pulling in I see it a lot in legal dramas, especially Suits, it's just notorious for this, where they pull out this last shred of evidence that no one knows about. No, you can't just do that. That would be inadmissible. You actually need to apply and make sure that, that your evidence would actually stand up in court. And that's the reason why. So, half the time it's basically filing and making sure everyone knows what's going on. And then the next half is actually arguing, putting your case forward. And it's not going to be like a vicious, yelling match. Again, as what people see, when your spirits get fired up, it's true that it can come from witnesses or, or people on the stand, when they're you see those moments, but it's really going to be calm, methodical. People are going to keep a level head, the judge especially. And it's really so that the judge can wrap their head around, or judges, it could be like a whole bench. It's not going to be just left to a single judge. That's a lot. 50 charges is a lot. Probably going to be left to a full bench of judges to deliberate and really make sure that this is happening, because as Jacinda Ardern said, this is one of New Zealand's darkest days. So what that could mean legally is that this is going to set a precedent. What that means is that this is going to set the bar for, if anything like this again happens in the future, we have a reference point as to how to handle this and whether we need to change it or not down the track.
Okay, that you clarified that really well. I wanted to ask you in terms of the shooter himself, Brenton. He is Australian, and we're both Australian, so it's a bit scary. So I wanted to ask you, what sort of information do we have about him? His personal life. Because you said it was like a planned attack, and he did mention there were possibly parties that were supporting him. So maybe he did, meet up with people in different countries to gain that training, or I guess be also brainwashed to an extent in order to carry out the attacks. So do we know more about his personal, what do we know about his personal life in general, Brenton, where he came from, and, what made him do these attacks, I guess?
I think a lot of media outlets really went gung-ho into this whole, this was just an innocent young boy with golden blonde hair that got sucked into the darkness that exists in the world. I tried to keep it bare to the facts. And I tried to also not give him too much attention, because, our priority are the victims and their families and what this means for us. I think we really need to shift our mindset as to how much attention we actually give these people. Especially when it does no good for us, because now he's contextualized into this three-dimensional person with faults and dreams and aspirations. And we know that that same privilege isn't going to be afforded to any of our people in respect. And we know that because it pans out all the time, right? What we do know is that he basically grew up in Grafton in New South Wales, so in the regions, and he basically stayed there until 2011. And from what people have said about Grafton is that, when you talk about people who actually have lived out in the country, and my colleagues who come from there, they're basically saying that it's not surprising that it's come from Grafton. Apparently there's this kind of attitude there that is very much in line, not to like white supremacist tendencies, but it's known at times to be intolerant, and it shows in the actual demographic of the population. So he basically has been in Australia, if he's 28 now, he's basically been in Australia for most of his life, and then moved to New Zealand in 2011. And he worked as a personal trainer at a gym near Christchurch. And that's as much as I was going to give him, because, if we've seen with the Daily Mirror or with the UK tabloids, they found pictures of his family. I know 9 News did an interview with his family back in Grafton the weekend of, and, really contextualize him as this sweet boy who was, friendly and loving, and you can't possibly fathom how he could get himself into something so ugly. And I just found distinct parallels. I don't know if you've seen it, or if you have, I don't know if you've also thought this as well. When I saw those initial interviews, and I only saw snippets because, like I said, my focus was on our community, it really drew parallels with Muslim mums whose boys have ran off and went to support ISIS. It's very much the same thing, and where it's the same story of a parent who thought they were raising this loving child who's innocent, who's respectful of human life, and would never be capable of committing such, inhumane atrocities, actually goes and does that. And now they're left with this shock and horror and disbelief. And now they're just questioning their whole purpose in life and wondering, where did I go wrong? I found those parallels to be strange, like extremely strange, but the treatment of one is completely separate to the treatment of the other. But that's what we know so far. So I think they're still, they're obviously still digging and trying to find out where he went in. It's basically once he got into the dark side of the internet and just found like-minded people. I think he was spurred on by a lot of coverage. He said he was inspired by Donald Trump, and I think we can make that assumption that he was inspired by the politics that goes on here with regard to One Nation and those, hard right elements of the Liberal and National Party, which Grafton is a constituent of. So it's not hard to piece together that picture. I think what is hard for society at large to is accept that an Australian did this.
I do want to touch on the manifesto. I don't know if you have I've actually tried to look for it online. I don't know why, but just for the sake of this episode, I couldn't find it. But
it was removed.
Anyways, it was and it was 73 pages, but from what we've gathered, from what I've gathered watching other news outlets and, shows that are on YouTube, they've actually talked more in depth about the manifesto. So the two things that did strike or turn my attention to was the fact, as you just mentioned, Trump was his inspiration. The other one was Candace Owens, interestingly enough. Actually, not that interesting, but I wanted to ask, was because the manifesto apparently was clear about his intentions and motives, so the media couldn't really speculate that there were other, like they couldn't, usually when an attack like this happens, if there's nothing laid out like concrete, you can just speculate,
right,
he had this intention, that intention, but that manifesto made it like clear, so no one could really do a spin on his intentions specifically. But he did mention Trump and he did mention Candace Owens, but then I heard people talking about the fact that he may have been trolling as well. What's your take on that? Like, a lot of the stuff that he mentioned may have been just a troll to get those people in trouble or put them under the microscope to sort of turn the attention to perhaps certain elements in the community, like, I don't know, alt-right groups that are Islamophobic, for example. So what's your take on that from, because you are actually in the, news and media. So what's your take on that specifically?
Well, I unfortunately skimmed the manifesto when it was still available. And I think people are right about the trolling aspect, because we've seen that when he, made that whole like and subscribe to PewDiePie thing right before he entered the mosque, right? So he said that very clearly in his live stream. So that element of trolling, it doesn't come as a surprise if he made a post up on 8chan, prior to the attack with support. I think there's that element, especially amongst white nationalist and white supremacist groups. They tend to basically dox and bombard, people or elements that they don't agree with. That's very much part and parcel of one of their, quote unquote guerrilla tactics. But with the manifesto, it was just plain as day as to what he was going about. I remember reading that, he basically described himself as like, I'm a 28-year-old man. I come from Australia. I really am a good person. It's just that I don't like seeing my country, being taken over by all these people. Very soon, the white population is going to dwindle, and we're going to be the minority, and we're going to go extinct because we keep having, all these people from Africa and the Middle East coming over and taking over our land and our opportunities. So that it wasn't just clear, this is what he said, almost verbatim, like he was going to do something about it because he feared that the white race was being exterminated. And so he felt that it was his duty to help rectify that and make sure to keep white lands pure. And that's incredibly problematic, because not only does it mean that he was not just going to go after Muslims, although he did reference that, but after that, it was clear there was going to be motive for other elements of the community. Maybe he's going to go after the Asian community next. After that, it's going to be the African community. After that, it's going to, just going to slowly eliminate everyone until there's a white race left in Australia. But there's also this chilling, I don't even say like ignorance, but he was like well aware when he said that, he wanted to keep the white race pure and on white land. It completely erased Indigenous people. It's like they didn't exist. That's what I also got from it as well when I skimmed it. And him referencing these people as inspiration, I don't think it was more like, he mobilized around the ideas that they were putting out. I think he had these ideas before, and having those positions of power, like, having Donald Trump basically vocalize what he vocalize what he believed in. And Candace Owens, who, people like Candace Owens are extremely loved by the far right because they play into the whole, well, she's a person of color, she's black, but she still agrees with us. So she helps validate. She becomes that, I have that one black friend that thinks that way. And I think that he just referenced these political figures as validation for his own, as validation for his own ideology and manifesto. And it's very much consistent with these far-right groups, because there's that connection to Austria, and where they basically raided the far-right group that had the link to him. And there's clearly this network that exists on 8chan. So that's what I got from the manifesto.
I think these type of people really do need a history lesson, because I have no idea why they can claim to say such, things such as, this is our land and people are going to take over, when they literally have, they're pretty much in control of this land, number one, and two, they kind of butchered, many, even maybe in the millions or something, to get these lands, right? Especially the Aborigines here in Australia. So It's a bit, when they play victim card, it's really surprising, and I don't know if disgusting? They deliberately do that, or they're actually aware of the history and they just get, I guess, the element of ignorance. I have no idea, but
I wouldn't put it to ignorance. I think they're incredibly reductionist in that they choose to eliminate certain aspects. It's like, I'm leaving you out on purpose. That's That's what I get from it. But maybe it's because I'm a hard cynic.
And I wanted to touch on one point. Like, I know this, like Jacinda Arden, we can applaud her, leadership during this whole situation, and she's been very, very sympathetic towards the Muslim community, and she's, worn the veil and talked to many different people in the Muslim community, which is very, amazing of her to do that. At the same time, I do want to cherry pick just one comment that she did make. I remember, I think it was like the first press conference she did make after the attack actually happened. And I remember she was starting off by saying, these people, they may have come to this country, they may have been refugees, but they're still us. So that, I don't know, like when she said that, I got a bit confused. I'm like, what do you, like, I'm kind of lost for words, because it kind of plays into a narrative of, look, these countries are white, and whoever is of a different skin color, you are automatically assuming that they're refugees, or, they migrated, stuff like that. Because second generation, like I'm born here, I can't say that I migrated. So I don't know how you can assume the same thing for people that unfortunately, got shot during the masjid. So I felt that comment itself also sort of fits the whole narrative of, the West is white, and whoever comes to the West is not part of the West, and they have to kind of assimilate into that society. Kind of plays into the white ideology, or the white gaze, I guess. But what's your take on that perspective as well?
No, 100%. You've hit the nail on the head with that. I also puzzled over that comment because I was just side-eyeing it the whole time. We know that there were a few New Zealand-born victims in that mosque, so that defeats the purpose. But it also goes into the whole, they are us and us is them, and, we are all united in this like one love, hashtag support Christchurch, grief, social media, basically expressing that, love can solve this, and we can marry both these refugee backgrounds with New Zealand society, as if New Zealand society doesn't have, a distinct Maori population that was already there that don't identify as white. So it's very interesting. The whole unity tag thing, like, the only way we can solve this hatred is with love. I applaud the good intention, but it is incredibly naive to think that we can just settle our differences over a hug and just wearing the scarf for one day. It ignores where these ideas come from. It ignores the cracks in society that have been brewing there for the past 20 years. This didn't just sprout out of nowhere. And it doesn't matter if they were refugees or if they were born there. They, for all intents and purposes, were Kiwi. Like, that's it. They have citizenship. They were working there. They were living there. They identified as being part of the community. Like, you don't need to separate them any further. And that's why I don't like that whole rhetoric in that. And it's one of the, issues that we have with how multiculturalism basically plays out in a capitalist type democracy, right? It's how we have to select parts of ourselves in order, to chuck away in order to assimilate. But there's still enough difference to show that, no matter how much you do it, you're still going to be othered. You're still going to be distinct and separate. And I'm sure she had good intentions when she said it. But at the same time, I'm willing to maybe just give it a pass at this time, because we can acknowledge that her situation was incredibly difficult. Not only is she like the youngest, PM or like leader of a country ever, but this is the first time she's ever been elected to such a position. And this happens on her watch. This happens under her governance, right? And she handled it spectacularly, because she just put everyone and every single one of our politicians to shame, right? It was just like watching, I don't know, when you go into a preschool, right, and you just take a toy off one of the kids that is going to like yell and scream for the next 6 hours. That's what Australian politics was like. And New Zealand politics was very adult and mature, and we're going to put the victims first, and we're going to give them respect they deserve, and we're going to hold, we're going to broadcast the adhan for the whole world to see, and we're going to, publicize the Jummah prayer, and we're going to hold, respect their funerals and build a memorial because we understand that they're human. And it's so sad that it comes to that we are so enamored by how Jacinda has carried herself because she's just basically doing her job. It's like, wow, someone is doing their job. A prime minister is doing their duty in taking care of her constituents. I'm so blown away by that because the standard has plummeted so low since 2016. We now expect so little of our leaders in power that when one shows like a modicum of decency, we're all blown away by it. And it's not that she showed a modem. She went above and beyond. Like just a leader showing compassion. We're just like falling out of our chairs in shock, like, wow, is this really happening? But at the same time,
Exactly.
With the whole rhetoric surrounding the petition in getting her a Nobel Peace Prize, I think that is misguided because I don't think, and I've seen this commentary around that she's like milking it for political gain. I don't think that's on her mind right now.
Yeah, I was going to mention that. If I took a skeptic lens, you could say that she can play that card well. I don't think she has I'm sure people will have,
they'll have their doubts because a lot of people in New Zealand before this were very much skeptical. I was talking to my good friend I knew back from school. She moved to Auckland 6 years ago, and she was there when it panned out in New Zealand. So I was keeping tabs on her the whole time. And she basically explained that a lot of people in New Zealand are also astonished by her conduct because there was a lot of skepticism surrounding her ability as a leader when she got elected because she had no previous extensive political experience. She was so young. She was basically like a green bean in New Zealand Parliament. Some of her policies were maybe too left wing for some people, as it gets around elements or topics like social welfare or whatnot. And I would believe that her critics would say that she's basically milking this, in order to maybe get reelected down the line, if she does win a Nobel Peace Prize. But I don't think that's on her mind right now. The rhetoric around that I feel is misguided because again, we're so enamored by someone doing her job. And it's not that she doesn't deserve praise for what she's doing. But if we're going to talk about Nobel Peace Prize contenders, it should be the people that, it should be the Muslims who were at Masjid al-Nur who saved more people from getting killed at that time. I think there was one person who, gave the warning at the right time that saved 50 people from entering that mosque because he knew it was happening, just running down the street saying, don't enter. Right? I feel like it should have been people on the ground. If we were really serious about maintaining peace, I think the praise and recognition, not that, that the Christchurch Muslim community is asking for it, but they should be the contenders.
That's actually a really good point. I didn't actually think of it in that way, in terms of acknowledging the people actually on the ground that may have potentially, saved more lives. I do, however, want to touch on one point you said earlier in terms of unity. The reason I bring that up, because if people follow me on Facebook, I did make a post about it. It was a bit harsh, I guess, but it was on the concept of unity, and I got pumped. But you actually, I think literally, because we did the last episode with Morrison, he said the exact same thing. The idea of we're just going to all unite against hate. We're just going to put all our differences to the side and show how we hate people like, white supremacist groups or people of, nature of Brenton. It's really my perspective, and I want to get your thoughts as well. But from my perspective, I've seen it because, alhamdulillah, running Boys in the Cave, you have to, go back and forth with organizations, so you're interacting with people on an organizational level, and even with I'm affiliated with the MSAs here in Sydney as well, so after the attacks happened, you're already seeing things play out. There's some a lot of not politics, but groups trying to get in touch with you, saying do this, do that, show their condolences, which is great, which is amazing, because a lot of people actually showing, they're being generous, they're really showing the sympathies and really caring about the lives that got lost, right? Because it was horrific. It's something that hasn't happened especially in the West, in a long time of such a nature, especially with people that are that are just worshipping and weren't doing anything bad or anything like that, or weren't doing anything to start anything else. But then seeing it on an organizational level was when I started saying, like, hold on a minute, well, what's happening here? For example, I can't verify these facts per se, but there is a Zionist leaning group that wanted to interact with all the religious groups on campus to do like a fundraising, or just to, you know, all come together and raise funds for the people of Christchurch. Then as a Muslim, you should be scratching your head thinking, hold on a minute, these guys, if they're actually happy to, you know, concede the fact that they want Palestinians exterminated or harm Palestinian people, how in the world are you siding with them in order to, you know, show sympathies to the lives that got lost in Christchurch? Actually, it's so hypocritical. Like, you can't do that. Like, it makes no sense. And so that's where my post kind of came from, that aspect of encountering such situations. There was also situations like, it's not as major as that, because that's actually pretty big. Like, why would you side with a Zionist group? It doesn't make any sense. But the other one was like events that were actually happening they were doing practices or doing these sort of performances that are very against, you know, the practice of Islam. So as Muslims, we should have a backbone and say, look, we understand you're doing it, you know, out of, you know, love, because you're saddened by the events that occurred in Christchurch, but you've got to understand that you can't compromise on your Islamic ideals just to show that, you know, to make a point, I guess. Like, you got to have some sort of a backbone to show that, okay, don't violate our principles or our practices that go against the teachings of Islam in order to show, you know, your commemoration for the people lost. So I started playing it out on an organizational level, and if you have your cards right, you have to have a backbone, but at the same time show that, yes, we can unite, but not in unity in the sense of forgetting every single differences that we have, because those differences actually weigh a lot, especially, for example, you know, the Palestinian and the, you know, the conflict in Israel, that sort of stuff. So you got to keep these things in mind. But in terms of unity in particular, I just wanted to get your perspective of just how the media is kind of playing this narrative of let's all unite against the you know, white supremacist groups, for example. But what happens is that what gets glossed over, and we kind of touched this on the episode with Uthman Badr, was that we forget what actually perpetrates these actions, like the actions of the government, the actions of perhaps media times when they are sensationalizing, you know, Islamophobia, and, you know, you got Rupert Murdoch coming out saying all this stuff against Muslims. These sort of perpetuate or make it known to, or it sort of justifies the thinkings of the white supremacist groups, for example. But I would like to get your thoughts on that, and unity in general, and the concept of unity.
Yeah, no, that basically my position is that it's a lot more complicated than just showering us with love and hugs and, you know, wishing that this would all go away. What I think happened on a community level, from what you're describing and from what I've seen of Muslim leadership in Australia, is that I think they grappled with, like, for the first time, we're not the perpetrators. Like, we actually suffered from this event. And so any solidarity, any commemoration, any helping hand from any aspect of society is now welcome, because for so long it's just been us and us alone trying to fight this battle of, dismantling the whole narrative that terrorism has a founding in Islam, and, you know, it sources itself out of the Middle East, and there's like intricate links between culture and that we're inherently violent. Like, you know, it gets exhausting fighting this battle and repeating the same conversations over and over and over again for the past 20 years, so that once you're fed a shred of compassion, we're just willing to take it. And I think that's what happened. But you're right, it shouldn't come at the expense of our values, because while this is all happening, for context, Ilhan Omar in the US is still being grilled over her Benjamin's tweet, in basically saying that APAC as a government lobby is basically throwing money at the government to ensure that they remain pro-Israel, and just her criticizing that whole thing from the lens of foreign interference, let alone just bringing up the Palestinian conflict. And she does that later on, but she's still copying it for just putting up criticism, and we've got so many other issues that are panning out right now that are still very much antithetical to what we stand for, that we should be more discerning in where we throw around our support, because at the end of the day, these people don't understand our grief. Like, it's not something that just sprouted overnight, or like we're just sad that 50 people lost their lives. No, this culminated in something that we've all been dealing with for the past 2 decades, literally since the millennium started. We haven't been able to escape this. And, as children who grew up with 9/11 as their most defining event, I feel like, as kids, we lost that ability to be innocent children, because then we started waking up to this world that was incredibly polarizing and, put us in this weird dichotomy where you're not good enough to be a victim, but you also have propensity to be evil. Like, if there's this double bind that's happening, and that doesn't just go away. Like, we have this shared grief that goes deeper than just people being lost. It's because it's such a harmful ideology that was allowed to thrive and grow, and was completely dismissed as this fringe ideal. And, the majority of Australians, or, majority of New Zealanders don't think that way. How do we know? The majority is silent. And we all know that quote that says, evil can reign when good people do nothing. Well, a lot of good people did nothing in trying to dismantle this early on. And it's not like it's sprouted out of nowhere. This rhetoric, if you want an Australian political timeline, this came in when Pauline Hanson came in. And that was in the late 90s. I think she made her maiden speech about the fears of Asian migration, I believe in 1996 or 97. So there's a big history. Like, we don't even need to go that far. The White Australia policy, or the remaining elements of it, which was basically white supremacy or white nationalism, that was enacted in law. Like, this was part of our constitution. This was embedded in our laws. All of our legal instruments were based off this principle, as well as others, was repealed in 1975. That's not ages ago. That's literally less than 50 years ago. Like, it's really recent, and especially like in a young country that, such as Australia, with the whole concept of terra nullius, this didn't just come out of nowhere. And it's really disingenuous when people are trying to share our grief and our struggles, that they're able to just say, well, a hug will make it better. Like, if we just love each other and just ignore the differences and practice tolerance, which, by the way, is really counterproductive, because tolerance means I don't like how you go about living your life and what you stand for, but I'm going to put up with you anyway. Well, then what happens when you don't put up with it? This happens. Well, this is the extreme of what can happen. So we really, really need to be super critical about how we show unity. And I think we need to take the lead on this conversation as to answer people's query, or, well, what can we do to help you? Well, then we can come up with it, with supporting Muslim businesses, helping us get into, if we need to work within the system, maybe get more of us into politics or into media, so that way we can normalize ourselves as part of society, which hasn't been working. We needed those doors opened. Maybe you could do that. Or maybe you can stay silent and allow us to have our peace, give us your platforms, allow us to speak for ourselves, don't co-opt our grief, if you have any relatives that support this kind of thinking, try and shut it down. We can't do that for you. It's a really complex conversation.
That was a lot of gold that you said there. And I actually want to touch on, because what you're kind of alluding to is the greater politics, and the fact that we can't just forget everything, put that, to the side, and kind of give hugs and then go about life after. Because as you mentioned, on this specific issue, I guess no one can say that they don't want to show the sympathy. That we're all sad. We're all uniting on that element, which is fine on an emotional level, right? But what about other situations? Like, for example, you mentioned a good point about Ilhan Omar. she's going through, quite a lot on her own in USA. There's that whole talk in the USA about, is showing, your disapproval of Israel mean that you're anti-Semite? And she's copying it hard, you know what I mean? Especially from Donald Trump and from the higher ups as well in America. So there's this greater politics that are being played out. And you actually mentioned that great point about, white Australia. It hasn't even been that long since, we got, quote unquote, our, the minorities got their quote unquote rights in Australia, right? So all these things that you have to be aware of. And I do want to touch on another point about, because we've had Dilly Hussein, who's really good friend of mine, and he's been on our show in the past. He runs 5 Pillars. He was actually on, I think it was Good Morning UK, I think that's what it's called, and he was on, this was like a few days ago actually, he was on to discuss the whole idea of LGBTQ being taught about that in schools, and how I think people as young as 6 years old, if they should be taught that in schools. And obviously the Muslim community is a bit of an uproar about that. So he came on to kind of defend, why this shouldn't happen essentially, and why Muslim parents are showing disapproval. And you could tell he was more focused on, the nitty gritty aspects in terms of, it's because they the Muslim parents were given transparency, the kids are too young, this and that. And you could see from the host's name skipping my mind, but anyways, he wanted
Piers
to
Morgan.
Yeah, Piers Morgan, that's it. And he wanted to lay it down, saying that it's your religion, it's because you're intolerant and you're homophobic, etc., etc. It kind of, it's funny because it's not that long ago from the Christchurch shootings, and you see this intolerance for accepting differences, right? You're seeing it play out, and then you're saying, oh, everyone kind of give hugs and everyone come together for the Christchurch attacks. They're not really accepting like this liberal kind of secular society on the whole, in terms of the people that are like higher up, the politicians, for example. They have, there's a like kind of like a power dynamics being played out.
That's right.
And they're not fully accepting of our way of life. They're going to sort of enforce how they want things onto us. And it's about if we can kind of fit into the picture. And this kind of goes back to the idea of how if Muslims can quote unquote assimilate into this society, whatever that means. And Scott Morrison alluded to that, in the past as well as many prime ministers, and we can actually touch on that later. But there's this greater narrative that the people need to be aware of, and not just siding with everyone on the left in order to combat the extreme people on the right. You have to be aware of these sort of narratives that are being played out and the greater politics. And that's why I actually did the earlier 2 episodes. I know we've touched on this now because with you it was more about facts, but because we wanted to touch on how to react as a community. We can't just go with what society wants, and the whole society is obviously mourning and we're just giving hugs, but there's more things to do. Where do we go from this? We can't just give hugs. We need to take actions in order to give, I guess, minorities more voice, the more transparency in the media, and as you just mentioned, in politics, to change that sort of discourse. But yeah, did you have any thoughts to add in regards to that in general, or?
No, basically, you hit the nail on the head in the sense of it's very much misguided to think that any show of support now from this one tragedy is going to basically wipe out 20 years of scapegoating and, specific mistreatment and discrimination. This isn't going to be swept under the rug. We still have a lot of elements of legislation, that are more or less targeting us in terms of the way anti-terror legislation is framed, the way police are monitoring us. ASIO are still going to be seeking out informants in mosques. We're still going to be policed. It wasn't that long ago, New South Wales Police had a specific Middle Eastern task force. Like, we're not done being the scapegoat. What this proved was that, people, or like white supremacy, retaliated, or that it actually striked and attacked. And what this put in everyone's conscious is that, oh no, they can't be the bad guys anymore because they were the victims this time and no one else prompted them to do that. they acted of their own accord. But don't think for a second that this doesn't wipe out when everything has been put in place. So we have to be smarter and wary and realize that along the power hierarchy, we are still at the bottom in order to affect any kind of change or make any kind of meaningful progress. It doesn't wipe out any of that has been put in place. It really doesn't. So we need to be wary and really critical of how we go about things from this point onwards, because while we're in that position, I think if we do it right, or if the community does it right, we'll be able not to gain more leeway, because we're not after society's acceptance. We're here to prove that, the way that we exist right now should be enough. Like, we already do what society asks us to. We contribute, we pay taxes, we're, getting ourselves educated, we're giving back to the community. Like, it's a lot to just put on the face of assimilation list. So now, if we're going to talk about the free marketplace of ideas and where we fit into that, we have to be way more critical and nuanced, but we have to remember that we're not going to be given that space to be critical and nuanced just yet.
Because exactly that. I wanted to bring up example, like for example, you would know yourself locally in Sydney, wasn't it? Like, it was a few months back where Kama Nizamuddin, who's actually a friend of mine, and he was put on terror charges, and it was because of a note that was supposedly he was accused of writing a note to, plan to kill certain politicians, and he was sent to straight jail, and he was locked up in prison for a month.
He was in maximum security prison in Goulburn, so not even in Sydney. So Goulburn is at least a couple hours out of the city, and I think he was only afforded one phone call in the entire month that he had been detained without charge.
Exactly, and these why that hits closer to home is because I actually knew Kamal Nizamuddin. He went to UNSW. I go UNSW.
Wow.
It was in the MSA. I actually knew him, and when it actually happened, and this is one of the biggest regrets when I've been running Boys in the Cave, is that we weren't prompted enough to do episodes to actually go use our resources in order to help him out. We were sort of in shock, because we hear about situations like this, in different countries or whatnot. People just get randomly chucked in jail, and that's about it. And you hear it in America as well. I happened to Mozambique, I think, when he went to Guantanamo Bay. But when it hit close to home, someone I actually knew well, I was shocked. So I was messaging people, asking, what's happening, and making sure, I'm up to date with what's actually happening with him specifically. But it was the biggest injustice in history, and alhamdulillah, he actually got out. I think he's trying to
he's going to sue New South Wales Police for basically the treatment of him. Rightfully so. He was detained without charge, and so that was a violation of his rights.
And I think the rule they sort of used, or the law they use, is the fact that there's actually a rule in place where you can get people jailed on charges of terrorism without a proceeding or anything. You can just take them and put them in jail. But I'm not too sure about the specifics. But there are laws in place like that in order to put innocent people essentially in jails for no reason. And that it's not, I think it's more targeted towards the minorities, people more susceptible. I don't think it's going to happen to a white person per se either. So these things are in place that are, inhibiting or putting a Muslim community in a tough situation. And if we are just looking at it from the perspective of, hugs and kisses, it doesn't really go at these, we don't touch these bigger issues that are actually occurring. But I did want to ask you in terms of, because you're in the media organization and we're actually talking about, perspectives and how we should approach things. And you mentioned that I can't remember what she said exactly, sorry, but in terms of media perspective and the empathy or the sympathy that's been happening for the Muslim community for this specific situation, would you say that the media perception of Muslims, because we've seen a lot of, hate towards Muslims in, pretty much front page newspapers, right? So do you think all that sort of things in the past, is that going to change now? So are they going to be a bit more nicer or anything like that because of these because of the situation at Christchurch? Do you know anything about that in specifically? Have you noticed a change of that nature or?
Well, it really depends on which media organisation. Here in Australia specifically, we lack a lot of what we call media diversity. So what that means is that in the media landscape, pretty much it's been taken up by 2 or 3 major players in the game. There's not much room for indie media or independent media to exist outside these companies. So a perfect example would be just last year, Channel 9, which is like a commercial TV network. They do have their own news department, but, they largely they have like 3 channels or something on free to air. They bought Fairfax, which in an Australian institution has been independent media this whole time, and they tend to be more left leaning, as opposed to Nine, who bought them, being more very much center right. They do kind of pander to that kind of like blokey, larrikin, like, typical, Anglo-Australian family type content in the way that they go about and position themselves in. So it doesn't leave a lot of room for nuance. A lot of people were worried about that merger in saying that, Fairfax is going to lose its edge, because in Australia, it can very much be split into left and right. So you have, News Corp, who have like the Daily Telegraph and the Herald Sun. I don't see them switching sympathies anytime soon. Yes, I'm not sure if you've seen, was it the Daily Telegraph that put in that one cover that actually, that said like, it wasn't Salam, but it had like, peace be upon you, when there was this cartoon drawing of like, some kind of solidarity with some Muslim figures. And I was just shaking my head, because it wasn't that long ago, like 2017, when they got successfully sued for defamation by portraying the Australian Mufti, Dr. Ibrahim Muhammad, as the 3 monkeys that say, was it like, hear no evil, like see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil? They photoshopped him as that, and basically defamed him. And, it's really hard to pin it through, because that's happening in the commercial land space. And, you have to remember that they have shareholders to answer to. They have audiences and subscribers that not that they pander to, but they have to cater for in terms of their content. And they know their audiences really well. So you've got Fairfax, who tend to be more nuanced and actually hire Muslim journalists. Not that the other side don't. There was this really interesting piece, I don't know if you've seen it, on the ABC, that involved a Sky News journalist who was Muslim resigning after Christchurch. And she basically pinned this opinion piece. And she worked for Sky News After Dark. In case for your viewers who don't know, Sky News After Dark is where it goes from being center right to complete lunacy, where they bring in anyone that, anyone that had that hard right, or like, borderline white nationalist politics, anyone that was incredibly controversial, got a slot after 6 p.m. and just ran with it. And in the piece, she actually questions herself, and it's something that Muslim journalists, in media, and particularly in Australia, have to face, is that how much more can I stomach and go against my ethics? Yes, I have this job and I work at Sky, but what am I endorsing? What am I working towards? Is this system really worth it? And she resigned because she just couldn't take what she saw behind the scenes anymore. So that's commercial, but we also have to remember with public broadcasters, they have specific legislation. So the ABC, and in conjunction the SBS, for your listeners, which is the Special Broadcasting Service, is dedicated to multicultural communities and basically giving every multicultural community in Australia a platform for their own content. And that in itself has been done very well, because they understand nuances. Not only that, they employ people from the community specifically. So SBS have radio stations in every single language that's spoken in Australia. everything is diverse from top to bottom. That's their job. That's their job. It's to make their content, and it's for people or people of color in Australia, and by extension, Indigenous people who have their own channel, NITV, to find content for them because it says so in their charter, in the SBS Act. That's what they're there for. And in conjunction with the ABC in Australia, who tend to be actually all right. Like they kind of fall in what I say is like the center. They're able to balance it out in their coverage. They do get it wrong, and I do tell them when they get it wrong, but they're able to basically discern and provide really nuanced coverage. And there are a few Muslim journalists as well in the ABC. And it's also there in their charter as well, in the ABC Act. It says that the job of the ABC is to inform, educate, and entertain all Australians. So you can't do and cover all Australians if you're going to intend to be polarizing and by extension isolating the Muslim community in general.
But yeah, like I can't always be bashing the government because they actually do a good job with SBS and ABC compared to obviously, you see Channel 9, Channel 7, they're a bit in a different kind of spectrum. So that's definitely you actually brought very good insights about that because not many people, especially around the world, would be aware of the politics when it comes to news broadcasting. And I'm sure people even in UK and US themselves won't actually know the underpinnings of how things kind of work when it comes to the media. And he also touched on the idea of how we can't be sure how the narrative will be played out in the media when it comes to portraying Muslims because there's a lot of things to take into consideration, such as shareholders. So those are things that we have to be aware of. So because a lot of Muslims will be thinking, oh wow, the media is so sympathetic. Like for example, the Adhan playing, I think I don't know if they played it out in the Parliament in New Zealand. I can't remember.
Yeah,
but a lot of things, like saying salam on the New Zealand newspaper, all these things, people are kind of shocked as well. Like that's like dawah as well.
Yeah, it was.
Like, how's this happening? So
it does have propensity. It does have propensity to do good. What matters is who we put in place in the media to get there. So clearly that we still have a lot of work to do because as we touched on earlier, we're not going to be afforded that nuance and critical discussion in the public space forever. This has an expiry date. The next time someone from our community does something or the next quote unquote terrorist attack happens, they're going to switch around and then recycle the old rhetoric. And then you've got, your public broadcasters and your left leading media basically trying to counteract that narrative. And it's going to be back to the political footballing again. But the way that we can counteract that is trying to normalize our position within the media. And that is hard in itself because we have to ask we have to ask ourselves the question of, do we need this? Do we need to actually play into this system that is almost, at times can be seen as designed to fail? And I try and take a more optimistic approach in saying that, Australian media isn't the be all and end all. There are other big players in the game that have readership and audiences within Australia, like The Guardian, for example, or Al Jazeera, that's making big waves here. People are, specifically with AJ Plus and the way that they go about their content, Vice, Fox, with the internet specifically, if we are able to get more of our ummah in there, not only do we normalize our stories, but then we're able to get that position in to counteract that narrative. And then hopefully the goal would be to have this narrative dismantled entirely. But we can't go that far as of yet because then that means in dismantling that narrative, we need to dismantle the colonialist project that all these societies are based on. So there are bigger questions in mind, but that's how I see it at this stage.
I wanted to ask you in particular, especially being in the media, you mentioned, all those news outlets like Vice, for example. So some of the what I've noticed that more left-leaning news outlets, since they're left by default, that means that they will also include people such as LGBTQ. Not that I'm discriminating against them, but I'm saying that we know Islamically, they say accepting values or saying that it's okay is like kind of going against our religion in a sense, but it's not like we treat them poorly and stuff. They're just like people, you talk to them this and that. But what happens in the news media outlet is that you're kind of grouped with people that have values that go against yours, right? So that in itself becomes an issue as well. Like, how do you navigate that? So what would you say, like, how would a Muslim sort of navigate that if they are in that space where you have to kind of define your values? Because once you define your values, the left think that you're actually you're alt-right or something, you know what I mean? Or you're on the far right as well, because you have this opinion about certain things that I guess the left all agree on is okay to have, if that makes sense. But what's your sort of take on that sort of situation?
We only just started getting into the media, and not that I think it's too early to pick and choose, and I'm not saying to like compromise on our values, but if we're going to be holding that argument that says that, well, because, you know, the left have issues that we don't agree with, we shouldn't work with them. And if the center right have issues that we don't agree with, we don't work with them. That means we just box ourselves out entirely. And we end up becoming really selective about the issues that we choose to, like, you know, this is the hill that we choose to die on. Because the example I gave was I could be writing an article on interest rates if I was a finance reporter, going to all these economists, you know, in wake of the Banking Royal Commission, and basically telling people this is what you do about borrowing money and this is what you do with your loans. If we're going to get really religious about it, talking about riba or like engaging in it is like waging war against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself, right? But that would seem like it would be okay because it's in finance, as opposed to talking about, like, say, you know, like sexuality and people's experiences, or, you know, the struggles that they go through and whatnot. It's really difficult as well because in this landscape, there is no Muslim media outlet. Like, you know, we have Al Jazeera, but that's that's not part of, you know, Australian media, and it's so saturated that it's really hard to just kind of, you know, basically have just this one media institution that's Muslim based, that's going to function like every other media institution and become, you know, part of the fourth estate, in that they're going to be talking about issues that affect Australian society. We're not there yet. And so I don't think that when we go on, like, you know, either left-leaning or like conservative or center profiles, that we automatically are adopting everything that they stand for. Because if they're supposed to be covering all issues, we can't tell them not to cover, like, you know, issues around, like, you know, like, say, for example, gender politics or arts and culture or music festivals, or, you know, dealing with drugs or alcohol abuse. You know, these are all things that we don't stand for. So I think it's really naive to just cut it off there. And I think it also speaks to our progress as a community to even talk about these issues inside or internally. Like, if we can't speak about things like, you know, the LGBT community, and like, I don't think we're giving that conversation enough nuance to begin with, because we immediately just shut it down without getting into, you know, how this is actually, you know, affecting people, or even things like racism within the Muslim community. We can't even have honest conversations about that, or treatment of women internally. Then why would we be trying to pick our battles externally? So that's how I come at it.
I wanted to touch on a point that you said a lot earlier in terms of the political football that's being played. So I do want to touch on the Australian government and their actions, because you mentioned that New Zealand have been, you know, very good with their conductings, and Australia, you know, have played it into a football match essentially. So what's your take on the Australian government's approach to the whole situation of Christchurch?
It's been nothing short of appalling. In New Zealand, they've moved, not that they've moved past it, but for the focus of the politics really centered around the appearance of white supremacy in New Zealand, and how long that it's been there, and what they're doing to combat it, and swiftly passing through gun laws as well as social media laws in trying to jail people or basically try and charge people who are sharing extremist content. And there's a similar discussion about that happening in Australia as well in Parliament. But what ended up happening was it was just a circus. You had senators who our taxpayer money goes to. We fund their pensions at the end of the day. You know, we had Fraser Anning and Pauline Hanson basically coming in and saying, we can understand how this person would get there given, you know, the amount of terrorist events and number of people killed by Muslims, that it's only natural that you'd have this retaliation and justifying it, which is all kinds of sick, especially coming from, you know, parliamentarians and senators that come up. But then what's even more disgusting is that you have, you know, this appearance from politicians coming in to support support and give condolences and basically say that they were an ally to the Muslim community this whole time. I'm referring to Scott Morrison in a sense when he referred to Jamal Rifi, who is one of the community elders on that project interview. But even then, it was really facetious, because what ended up happening was Waleed Ali gave that now viral video of his reaction to the Christchurch incident. His reaction went viral because it was fully emotional, and he rightfully called out politicians who were giving this show, this veneer that we actually care, when they actually use the community as a scapegoat time and again, especially within the Liberal Party, to justify Operation Sovereign Borders, to justify the opening of indefinite detention and the detention centres in Manus and Christmas Island, to justify, you know, Muslim surveillance. And each and every time, it wasn't even that long ago, maybe a year ago, when Scott Morrison basically said that the Muslim community needs to do more to prevent radical Islam from coming up, as if radical Islam was the default and there's only one and there's no such thing as, you know, as moderate. This must be the one ideal that we all subscribe to. It's ridiculous. And then to come around and basically say that, you know, we hugged, and, you know, again, that show of unity, we hugged with Muslim leadership and we cried, and they basically just voiced out, you know, their concerns, and I agreed with them. But then I don't know if you know, but Avani Dias from Hacking Triple J had found like this 30-second footage. It was up on her Twitter, of where they had Muslim leadership basically telling Scott Morrison off right before they took that picture. You know, that first picture with the white backdrop of the white wall. Basically, Sheikh Shadi Suleiman was laying into him, saying that this was all because you supported and you did nothing. You just turned the other way and said, this is fringe politics. This isn't going to impact Australia. And in conjunction with that, after, you know, Waleed's heartfelt plea, next thing you know, it hadn't even been 5 days. They weren't even, like, in second, they weren't even buried yet. They hadn't even the families hadn't even gotten the bodies back. And you had the Prime Minister of Australia threatening to sue the most high-profile Muslim journalist in Australia over comments that actually came out in a leaked document of a shadow cabinet meeting in 2011, where he said that we should use the anti-Muslim vote. There's a big majority that are really concerned about this. We should use it to our advantage, or that he highlighted it to begin with. It was ridiculous, because then he just threw the condolence right out the window. And all this is going on while Jacinda is going in, meeting victims and showing solidarity and passing gun laws. And like I said, doing her job. Australia completely failed. And it wasn't until he got an interview with Jacinda Ardern that Scott Morrison decided to come on the project and be interviewed by Waleed. And even then, that was horrific, because it was just coming in from a position of him speaking over Waleed, him just interjecting and not letting him just get out the question, dodging it, shading it. The way he was just sitting, his body posture, the smirk that he had. And it had, like I said, it just had been a week out of these events, and we had the leader of our country basically just dismissing Waleed and his concerns. And at that point, I think Waleed, we could safely say, was speaking for all of us in that sense of the frustration. He could have gone harder, but I don't think he had the opportunity. I mean, if this was him just safe balling questions at Scott Morrison with this kind of reaction. I don't even know what to think when you ask them the more serious ones.
I was actually I didn't actually know about the video on Twitter with Sheikh Shadi laying it to Scott Morrison. So I'm going to applaud him for that, because the narrative, like even, parts of the Muslim community are very critical about the actions of, LMA, for example, to, the Muslim leaders, and just, how can you just meet up with the government and take photos? Like, it just makes no sense, because they're the ones that kind of fuel this Islamophobia, number one. Number two, all the laws that they put upon, the Muslim community, such as, Kaman in Zamuddin, for example. Like, situations like that, you can't really side with the government. You got to be vocal against them.
Yep. So, and it echoes our discussion about the whole concept of this blanket unity. It's very much like the community leadership comes from a generation where being passive and being silent and just playing it safe was the way to go, and that hopefully all of this discussion would go away and we wouldn't be targeted for it. Well, it didn't work. And when we grew up, it didn't work. And now that we're grown and we were born here and we know how it works, it basically is just them ignoring the youth, or at least ignoring the younger generation that says we actually need to do something. We can't afford to be silent no longer. Otherwise, we're just going to keep copying it, and it's not going to get any better. And who knows, maybe down the line, we would be the next target should we be in a mosque on a Friday in Sydney or in Melbourne or anywhere in Australia, and some lunatic decides that this would be the right way towards preserving a white Australia. Like, how do we know that? It's because we were silent.
And the other thing that made me a bit angry was the fact that the only reason, because you mentioned the one-on-one chat Walid Ali had with Scott Morrison on live television, the fact that he was saying he was trying to portray that he was sympathetic towards the Muslim community, and he kept saying, look, me and Jamal Rifi, I gave him a call, and we're good friends. So,
and I went on a hike, and we went camping with Muslim youth, and I've done all this stuff because I have Muslim friends. It's the same rhetoric. It's the I have a black friend, therefore I can say all of this, all of this racist nonsense. No, it's completely facetious. I don't know if you saw that one clip when they were talking about, it was talking about indefinite detention and the detention of refugees on Manus Island, and he rolled his eyes at him. Scott Morrison rolled his eyes at Waleed because he kept cutting him off. He wouldn't let the question out. And then Waleed's like, can you actually just let me tell you the question? Can I just get it out? And he just rolled his eyes at him. It was so rude. Like, just from an adab perspective, like, this is the best we have for a leader. And we're less than 2 months out from an election. And this guy is literally telling the Australian people that we should elect him to continue leading us. It's beyond ridiculous.
And I would also put the blame on Muslim leaders as well, simply because Scott Morrison is able to use them as ammo, like they're quote unquote, how close they are with each other, and he can use that as ammo, saying, look, how much I've done for the Muslim community. Do you doubt my efforts for them? So I don't know, I think the fault is also on us that we can't have a principled stance or a clear stance, and making those points clear about how we are against the actions of the government, in regards to how they handle their issues or how they interact with the Muslim community. So 100%. A lot of it is also on our fault, I feel as well.
No, 100%. We had a part to play in this, or at least our parents' generation had a big part to play in this, because at the end of the day, we as the youth don't have that much power, even community-wise. I mean, we're starting to, when we're establishing our own organizations and initiative like this one with Boys in the Cave, or whether it be with Podium, and it's because we are frustrated with community politics. We're consistently being ignored, being told that we don't know any better, that we don't know how the world works, that we're naive in our approach, that engagement and actually challenging these narratives would get us anywhere. It doesn't work when you have this generational clash between an older generation that we still respect, but really don't understand how it works. And I'm not discounting the entirety of it. There are a lot of, leaders that are clearly supporting the youth in our endeavors to make this change. But it's still very much held by this old guard that is unwilling to allow anyone else to come in and basically shake it up and change it up for the better. And as a result, we have this fragmented leadership that isn't representing us fully as a unified body. Instead, we have these niches and break-offs and factions. And then we get people literally Imam Tawhidi coming in and speaking in on behalf of us because we don't have a unified leadership on this issue. So it's really, really complicated. We do ourselves a disservice.
I wanted to ask, how do you feel, because you mentioned the elections coming up, how this sort of play into where we're headed as a community in the future? Because, what do you make of it in general?
We have a lot of work to do in thinking that this one incident is going to change and give us a platform to be critical and nuanced without, being shut down as terrorist sympathizers or, backwater type religious zealots. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to require consistent pressure. But what this has opened up in my mind in terms of the way that Christchurch has been covered is that it's given us an opportunity to really come in and capitalize and at least challenge the narrative, because now we can get ourselves a platform. We are actually rising up to the occasion, and I'm seeing this with a lot of community activists and appearances and the media as well. It's now on everyone's minds, from society to politics to media to those who aren't interested, that this isn't a problem that isn't going to go away. It's now staring us in the face that white supremacy not only is a deadly ideology, but can actually kill people. The question is, what are we going to do about it? And it's really hard to really point out where we're going to be headed, because we're only, like I said at the beginning, 2 weeks out from the event. We're still very much in close proximity. This is going to be defined about how we go about organizing ourselves toward a solution. And again, I don't know what that solution is, because this is an incredibly complicated problem that can't be solved with just blanket unity. But this is something that's going to be defined in our position as to how we are going to be placed as a community, within a year, a year down the track or 5 years down the track. Because for a lot of our Muslim youth, Christchurch is their 9/11 moment. It's hitting them as a significant event in their lives that's going to shape them. Only this time it's the reverse. They're actually, unfortunately, seeing the ugliness that we're faced with that can actually kill us, right? So we need to make sure that we have to take care of ourselves as a community. We need to have those intense discussions and movement. We have to go beyond having conversations. We really need to unify on the inside in order to challenge the narrative on the outside. And the upcoming federal elections in May is a really key starter, because if it's going to pan out the way it happened in New South Wales, where we had a One Nation senator elected with the same rhetoric and the same ideology, he also lost a defamation battle against a Muslim journalist, Osman Faruqi, because he accused him of aiding and abetting terrorism and promoting anti-white racism in tweets, right? He got elected in New South Wales Parliament, and that was a week after the Christchurch attack, and it was a week after the same politicians were coming into our vigils, in our mosques, and maintaining this facade of sympathy, and yet still get this re-elected. So it's a real danger. And so we really need to mobilize and actually participate in this election. I know it's a really highly contested issue, from HT sections of society, and there's a really good discussion about how do we, should we vote? Should we even engage in the electoral process? I don't think we have a choice anymore. It really needs to happen, because if we don't, we get white supremacy and white nationalism validated and into parliament, into places where they can make laws that impact us. Do we really want to be giving them that kind of power? No, we don't. So that means we really, really need to get going and work within ourselves internally in order to fight externally.
those are definitely great takeaway points, and it's about sort of digging deeper than how we sort of see it in terms of just unity. We need to address the issues and the bigger issues at play, not just see it as just an event. Like, obviously, we are very sad about what's happened in Christchurch, and we want to find more about the lives that of the people that passed away, because it's hurt us deeply, especially being part of the Ummah. You're stricken with grief, and that's why at the same time, so we don't make sure such events occur in the future, we need to look a bit deeper and address the issues, or the bigger issues at play, get a nature of how the politics works, see the rhetoric of the leaders, and to see how we can combat it, and I guess provide and have like a safer community where we can get our voices out and really have a fair share of, or really getting the media narrative in the correct way, and not sort of demonize the rest of the Muslim community. So there's a lot of things to really grapple with, a lot of things to think about, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this particular episode more so like 2 to 3 weeks out from the event, so it's not clouded with emotion. Like, we are all emotional, but we needed to really be rational and logical in terms of how we approach and how we go about making sure such an event doesn't occur, and how do we really address the bigger issues within society. So this episode was fantastic, and we talked a lot of diverse issues within from the situation that occurred from Christchurch. So Jazakallah khair, Ryma, for coming on Boys in the Cave. It was really insightful episode, and I hope inshallah a lot of people take away points, and people may perhaps see that they can also contribute in some way to changing the narrative that exists, especially in media, for example.
Oh, Iyakum, thank you for having me. And it's basically, this platform is heading in the right direction where we're taking it into our own hands. And so I applaud Boys in the Cave for starting up this initiative of a podcast, more or less, because it's thinking outside the box, and we're now critically engaging in ideas, and we have a space to do it. So Jazakallah khairan for having me.
Wayakum. Yeah, that's actually a good thought that you brought up, because that was actually why we started up initially, because we felt that whatever you hear from a Muslim organization saying things, I always felt that it was because the government kind of forced them to say in such a way they have to be nice and play that quote unquote good Muslim card. But Boys in the Cave is more about just being a hub of throwing out ideas and not being fearful. Like, we'll talk, I don't know, philosophical ideas till even concepts about politics, I don't even caliphate, things that seem taboo to the rest of, the population. But we want to throw out those ideas and really put out the, greater picture of, caring for the Ummah, essentially. That's what it boils down to, and
100%.
working what's best for the Ummah in general. So, yeah, Jazakallah khair for coming on again, and I hope to have you on again, because I'd love to get your insights in terms of the media portrayal of Muslims, especially in Australia. Like, alhamdulillah, we had Dilly Hussein, and he's more based in UK, but we don't have someone that's kind of specializing. I don't know, would you say you're like the only kind of Muslim that's in the media? Like, I know there's a lot, but I haven't really, like, the only ones that I kind of hear about is Walid Ali, but the criticism of him is that he is more like, he doesn't speak his mind per se. He's more has to tread a fine line in what he says. But what would you say the narrative? So what would you say is how are Muslims like in the media space in Australia specifically?
To be honest, we're very slow and up and coming. Willie does have to tread a fine line, because it's the first time you actually have a Muslim presenter, period. And
first time we made it to the big
first time
leagues.
we made it, right? So there's a lot riding on it. And I get that it's frustrating that you have people like, for the community to have someone who's actually there, but then is not able to challenge. But to be honest, he has a lot on his shoulders, and I'm not condoning, because I've heard, there are, issues with his politics, but then again, we're such a diverse community. I don't think we're going to be monolithic in the way that we approach our political situations. But to be honest, it is really up and coming. There are a few like Muslim journalists, but I think it's used in the sense of them being, let's say, like culturally Muslim. I don't know if they're actually like practicing or not, but they identify as Muslim. And that's, you know, in Australia, I think that's what matters because there are so little of us. So the ABC, we have Osman Faruqi for ABC Life, but he was previously the political editor of Junkie, I believe. We have Noor Haider, who is the state political reporter, or one of the state political reporters in New South Wales. We've got Suwaiba Hanifa, who is one of the first like hijabi journalists as well. Like that's a big thing. She's based currently in regional South Australia, but she won the Women in Media Scholarship earlier this year as well. So they're up and coming. There are a few that are in university making the rounds, and I'm sure I'm probably missing out some, but it is really, really small. And I think what ends up happening is a lot of the Muslim journalists before, like, you know, Mohammed Taha and Tamina Ansari, who are also at the ABC, they all got picked up by TRT World, and they decided, well, you know what, it's a Muslim media organization. It's in Istanbul. It's in a cool country. Why not? So they all just up and left by the time I got in. So it's been really, it's like, why would you leave me? I need a role model. It's a bit isolating, but at the same time, I figure if we can get our community behind this and actually push more Muslims towards the media industry, particularly now that the internet's really opening up opportunities to go independent, I think we can get something good going.
Inshallah, it sounds exciting, and inshallah you can be that voice as well for people like us in the Muslim community, or be a Muslim voice in the media as well, because it's very much needed at this point in time as well. So inshallah you can do that for us.
Inshallah, no pressure. No pressure.
Alhamdulillah. So for our listeners, thank you for giving us your attention. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to email us at info@boysinthecave, or you can also check us out on Facebook or Instagram, and you can give us a 5-star rating on iTunes, and that actually helps us go up the rankings. So inshallah, do that as well. And from our special guests, Ryma Tchier and myself, we wish you all the best. This is Tanzim signing off. Assalamu alaikum.